let me first start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I live and work, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and I would also like to acknowledge any First Nations people who are joining this webinar. ActionAid acknowledges that we are working and living on stolen land, and this was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm Michelle Higelin. I'm the Executive Director of ActionAid Australia, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar, Justice for Palestine, with our very special guest, Jamil Sawalmeh, who is the Country Director of ActionAid Palestine. Welcome, Jamil. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And I will say through this webinar, if you do have questions for Jamil, we'll have some time later in the webinar to try and get to some of those questions. So please do put your questions in the chat, and we'll try and, through this webinar, we'll be talking about some of the situation in Gaza in relation to the ceasefire, as well as in the West Bank, and some of the actions that we can be taking from this moment onwards towards justice for the Palestinian people. For those of you who don't know so much about ActionAid, we are part of a global federation working in over 70 countries to advance women's rights and end poverty and injustice. And we have worked in Palestine for almost 2 decades in both the West Bank and Gaza. And of course, since October 2023, ActionAid Palestine and its local partners have been responding to the devastating situation in Gaza. In the last year alone, those humanitarian efforts have reached more than 500,000 people with vital support, including food, water, shelter, maternal health care, and psychosocial support. So I do want to also start just by thanking any of you on the webinar who've been part of supporting ActionAid's humanitarian appeal for Gaza. All of those efforts have been critical in getting life-saving support to the people of Gaza. I know all of us here on the webinar tonight, we have all been following the horrors that have unfolded as genocide has taken place in Gaza, where 65,000 plus people have been killed, mostly civilians, including doctors, journalists, aid workers. We've seen and watched as famine has been declared in Gaza City. And obviously since the start of this year, watching as more than 1 million people have been displaced. So it's been a horrendous situation. I know many of us felt somewhat a glimmer of hope with the announcement of the ceasefire last week. So I wanted to start there, Jamil, and hear your reactions, your immediate reactions to the ceasefire announcement when you heard the news.
Well, definitely for us, and first of all, thank you for having me, Michelle, and I really welcome everybody to the webinar. And I hope that this becomes an opportunity for us to speak more about, in depth about what's happening. But back to the ceasefire announcement, this definitely represents a very cautious glimpse of hope that we're having now. And it's very important to note that we welcome any effort that would actually stop the bloodshed, the killing, the bombardment, and the repeated forcible displacement, the deprivation of any sort of life support, as well as basic services in Gaza. So for us, this represents a start of a new chapter of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And as I said, we definitely need to make sure that all parties are now abiding by the current ceasefire agreement, and also third states are also supporting the efforts to make sure that this represents a first step towards a more permanent and lasting ceasefire. And this is definitely will allow us as humanitarian actors to be able to scale up our operations and to continue reaching the most vulnerable population, in which case all of Gaza now. And as you have alluded to, 1 million people have been displaced just recently. But when we look at the situation now, where we look at 1.9 million people who have lost their homes completely. So we're talking about a continuous displacement, and the ceasefire doesn't mean that the humanitarian crisis has ended in Gaza. And I think it's very important to note that while before the ceasefire, everybody in Gaza have turned on their survival mode. So people were very much trying to look for shelter and trying to look for the next meal. And this means that people did not come to terms with the level of destruction and the scale of loss in Gaza. And we are actually now assessing this situation and trying to work with our local partners to see how much can we complement the very much needed humanitarian aid. But there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of rehabilitating the human, because the social fabric in Gaza have been torn apart. Families have been destroyed, and even some social issues have started to emerge because of the lack of every type of service in Gaza currently. And this has a huge impact on women and children in particular, whom we have continued to serve throughout the 24 months of the war. And it's very important also to note in this ceasefire, in the bigger scheme of things, we definitely do not see this as a peace plan. We look at this from the most immediate impact on the war, which has stopped the bloodshed. But if we want to consider this to be a peace plan, we think that there are so many elements that are still missing from this to be called a peace plan. One of those is definitely the need to centralize the Palestinian voices. And we know that this has come as a result of merely US efforts supported by a few countries. And unfortunately, as you know, the media started covering this US plan, there's very little mention of the Palestinians and how the Palestinians are actually being involved in their own issues. And there is lots of engagement from other actors that we definitely see that as merely political interest in what's happening in the region and the impact of the current war in the region, because there are also interests of countries that extend beyond ending the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So we are very cautious, honestly, to call this a peace plan. And the second element that we think that is very much missing out of this peace plan is the fact that the crisis in Palestine is not a humanitarian crisis. It's not about flour and drinking water and some services here and there. It's a political crisis, and it's been there for nearly 100 years now. And in order for us to call this a peace plan, we definitely need to make sure that it addresses the root causes of the conflict. And the root causes of the conflict are actually the bigger settler colonial project in Palestine and the occupation that the Palestinians are living under since 1948, the creation of the State of Israel. And therefore, we definitely, we are definitely interested to support any effort, that leads to a just and long-lasting peace. But that peace definitely need to consider what the Palestinians want in terms of their self-determination and how they want to be consulted or involved in any process that leads to peace. Because without the Palestinians, we think that any solution that could be introduced without the buy-in and the ownership of the Palestinians, that is not going to be viable. And as I said, also, we need to address the root causes. And without addressing the root causes, I think we are only introducing cosmetic solutions.
Yeah, thanks for those reflections, Jamil. And I think, yes, sort of a ceasefire is far from long-term peace and justice, of course, for the Palestinian people. And yes, I hope that, we'll see those elements start to unfold because it's critical to a long-term solution. I guess I'd like to go to, the situation and what you're hearing from partners in Gaza now. I know we've seen, images in the media of people, taking a long walk back to their homes and to see them destroyed. But, and as you mentioned, women and children are some of the worst affected. But what are you hearing about, the situation on the ground right at the moment?
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. Well, I think what would be important for us now is to try to paint a picture of what the Gazans have woken up to in the next day of the ceasefire. And let me quickly just run through the numbers, because this can kind of portrays the scale of the crisis in Gaza. As you mentioned earlier, we're nearly 76,000 Palestinians killed, more than 170,000 wounded. And just in relation to children in particular, we're talking about nearly 40,000 orphan children, 17,000 of which have actually lost both parents. So these are the figures that the people have woken up to. And we're talking about nearly 1,000 children who have lost at least one limb, as per the last figures from UNICEF. We're talking about 2,000 families who were completely erased from the civil register. And we're talking about 230 Palestinian journalists who have been killed in this conflict, more than 1,700 health workers, more than 500 aid workers, including internationals, have been killed in Gaza. So the morning of the ceasefire was a moment for the Gazans to start realizing the scale and the gravity of this humanitarian crisis. And of course, throughout the 24 months of this war, we always had nearly 100,000 pregnant and nursing women who have been actually deprived from everything, from nutrition to maternal health care to psychosocial support. And therefore, as you said, women and children have paid probably the highest price tag during this conflict. And we know that, as per the statistics that were released throughout the war, 70% of total people killed in Gaza were actually women and children. And this means that particularly women have found themselves in a very difficult situation when it comes to the fact that they have found themselves heading their families because of their partners and their husband being killed in the conflict. And therefore this adds additional burden on women in particular, and they found themselves in a very difficult situation where they have to provide to the families in a context where everything is scarce. Prices have gone up in a massive way, and therefore what we're hearing from our local partners now is the fact that there is a massive movement of people trying to go back to their homes, or the rubble of their homes, trying to identify and determine where their homes are actually, because the rubble is all mixed up. And when we talk about the rubble, this is one of the key issues we are trying to address now. As per the latest assessment from UNDP, there are 50 million metric tons of rubble in Gaza, which I think initial assessments suggest 5+ years only to get rid of the rubble. And the rubble becomes one of the major barriers to infrastructure rehabilitation. When we talk about road networks, water networks, electricity networks, medical services, and all of those, the rubble becomes a major issue. So people are only seeing rubble around them. And we have seen live footage from the people who have come back to Gaza City after the ceasefire was introduced, and then the safe routes into Gaza City were determined. Nearly 500,000 people have returned to Gaza, but the vast majority of those, nearly 90% of those have returned to the rubble of their homes. And this, again, just to reiterate the fact that we've mentioned, the ceasefire is only a beginning of a chapter of humanitarian needs. So the starvation is still there, the famine is still there, displacement is still there, lack of or shortage, severe shortage of shelter items, hygiene items, and dignity kits for women in particular are still massively short in Gaza. And this stems from the fact that up until this moment, we did not see a free flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Up until the last figure I checked yesterday from our access coordination mechanism as international organization, only 817 trucks have entered Gaza, in which the humanitarian protocol attached to the ceasefire agreement was supposed to have 4,200 trucks coming into Gaza on a weekly basis, which means nearly 600 to 700 trucks per day. But unfortunately, we are not seeing this number. We have seen multiple announcements from the Israeli government about the reopening of Rafah crossing with Egypt. And they're using unfortunately the opening of the crossing and the flow of humanitarian aid as a bargaining chip now in a political effort to settle the issue of the hostages in Gaza, which I think in which case still deprives the civilian population of their right to access food and safe drinking water and medical services. And we know in Gaza now, the health sector in Gaza is facing a near total collapse. And without the very much needed medical supplies and fuel in particular, the medical services will not be able to be restored. And we know that there are at least 19,000 wounded people in Gaza who are in need for medical evacuation because they need advanced health care that needs to be provided elsewhere, because the health sector in Gaza have nearly collapsed. So this is what the people are waking up to. And this means that our local partners are also trying to position resources and discuss with us the potential to scale up our operations, but we're heavily dependent on the real commitment to the ceasefire agreement and the unhindered access of humanitarian aid into Gaza.
Yeah. Thanks, Jamil. I mean, I think it's a very sobering picture that you've painted. And I mean, you know, many of us have watched from afar, seen a lot of images. And I mean, I note some of the comments in the chat. I mean, it is a despicable situation. You know, the fact that all infrastructure needed to support human life has been destroyed. And, you know, and imagine while there's a sense of relief that the bombing has stopped, it's now the reality of what is left, which clearly yes, as someone says, the scale of rebuilding is enormous and unimaginable. I guess one of the questions we've had from, and maybe let's sort of, you know, get onto this, conversation about the sort of humanitarian needs. One of the questions that's often come up with from different supporters has been, you know, how have we been able to, you know, get aid to people, particularly with the blockade that was in place and as you say, still continues to be in place. And I guess, you know, what we see is sort of the potential now. You know, we're getting closer to some increased aid delivery into Gaza. What are now the opportunities to be able to provide urgent relief to people?
Yeah, no, thanks. Let me begin with describing how we worked through the harsh reality during the war, of course. And you know, I have to start by acknowledging the efforts of our local partners who have been spearheading the humanitarian response. They were in the forefront of the humanitarian response in Gaza. Our local partners also been suffering the continued forcible displacement and also the killing and the bombardment everywhere, but they have never left. They've been moving with, you know, the displaced people in Gaza and trying to provide services in the most harsh operational conditions that they are also facing, the same as the civilian populations in Gaza. However, you know, part of our commitment as ActionAid is to continue working on a localized approach of the humanitarian response, in which we always made sure that we channel the maximum amount of resources to the local partners to enable them to respond. Now, how much did we manage actually to respond? Of course, we did not stop for a day, and our local partners did not stop for a day throughout the 24 months. But this is also to say that it has been extremely challenging, because determining the needs while the population are moving from one corner to the other because of the bombardment and the airstrikes and the continued evacuation orders coming from the Israeli army, was very difficult. But I have to say that our local partners have been very, very creative in coming up with solutions and working with whatever resources are available. We know that throughout the war, there has been a couple of pauses, tactical pauses, as they call them, in which some humanitarian aid was transported into Gaza, in addition, of course, to some commercial goods. And we have tried to work with our local partners to make sure that we maintain a sense of economy inside Gaza. So by supporting our local partners to purchase from the local vendors in Gaza, whatever is left in their warehouses, and to distribute that to the civilian population. In addition to that, of course, we worked with our local partners in Gaza to restore some of the agricultural activities. And we know that the vast majority of the agricultural land was completely destroyed because of the military operations and the bombardment and the destruction of water sources and water wells, desalination plants. So it was very much affected. But in the hardest time, when we couldn't find much of, you know, the humanitarian aid that is needed in Gaza, some of the farmers we supported were actually supplying some of the fresh produce in the market. Of course, that comes at a price, because every day we had to adjust to the prices that are shifting and fluctuating in Gaza because of the crisis. But this is to say that there was a strong commitment from our local partners to continue responding with whatever is available. And I think ActionAid has done a great job by making sure that we maintain that relationship with our local partners, but also extending flexibility to them to make sure that they are able to determine what is available, what are the needs, what are the gaps, how do we respond in this situation. And ActionAid provided all the support to the partners by, of course, you know, alleviating much of our organizational process that are required normally. And we work based on our long-standing and trust relationship with our local partners. In terms of the situation now, I think it's very important, Michelle, to also mention again that we still don't see free flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. And this is a critical element of the humanitarian protocol of the ceasefire agreement, because without that free flow of aid, we will not be able to deal with the most imminent impact of the starvation, the engineered famine that was in Gaza. People are malnutritioned. Women and children are actually deprived from basic nutritious food. Up until this moment, we still don't see any humanitarian aid being provided at scale, despite that we have heard some announcement from some UN agencies that they have actually managed to restart some of the bakeries in Gaza. So bread is one of the key elements that the UN are trying to provide now, working around the restricted aid into Gaza. However, we will continue to work with our local partners to make sure that they are still there no matter what is going to happen with the ceasefire, because this is our commitment to our local partners, but also to the civilian population to stay there and to continue to serve by providing any additional resources we can to our local partners to respond. But the point here is there has to be a political effort by third states to make sure that Israel is being held accountable to its obligations under the ceasefire agreement. And I think this is also third states have also to use their diplomatic and relationships with the US to make sure that the US is also exercising pressure on Israel, being the sponsor of the current ceasefire agreement, in addition, of course, to the mediators who have supported this. Now, this is a reality that we are dealing with as it unfolds, Michelle, and we need to continue to be adaptable and continue to be flexible in working with our local partners and making sure that we provide the support that they need, regards of what is going to happen with the opening of the crossing or not, how much humanitarian aid is being transported into Gaza, and it shouldn't be used as a bargaining chip. Unfortunately, it's been used as a bargaining chip now. But we remain hopeful that the ceasefire will hold, and we will start seeing more humanitarian aid coming into Gaza. But most importantly, also, we have to make sure that there is also commercial goods are being transported into Gaza. This will help the local economy to recover a bit and to allow our local partners as well as the civilian population to be able to purchase from the local market in Gaza, which will help restore some of the economic activities in the community, because this is part of the recovery. It helps, having, the civilian population feeling some sense of normalcy in their daily life.
Yeah, I think I can see there's lots of comments, and I think, recognizing, the incredible resilience, the local heroes who, so many of those partners are among the affected. I know we're among people who lost family and loved ones, but at the same time is trying to respond and to try and help the community. So yeah, it's incredible. I mean, it's been heartbreaking to read, some of the stories from our partners on the ground who, have to make tough choices even about how they feed their own children. And yes, I think we will definitely, even from our end, keep looking at how we can keep this pressure on accountability of Israel to meet that. Because yes, we saw this morning that obviously now sort of refusing to allow as many trucks in because, they haven't received the hostages as agreed. So yes, aid should never be a political bargaining chip. I guess before we talk about the West Bank, it would just be good to hear, I mean, given that there's such huge need, I mean, where will ActionAid prioritize with partners, over these coming months? Where do you even start?
I think it's very important, Michelle, is to always make sure that we are committed to stay and serve, despite all the challenges, despite all the barriers that we are facing. And I think this is the position of ActionAid. And this is the position that we have also extended to our local partners, making sure that they understand that we will always be there and try to support as much as we can. Because there are so many other operational challenges that we are facing in the context of Palestine. But I want to say that we have started thinking, or we have actually started positioning resources in Egypt, Michelle. We started positioning resources in Jordan to make sure that we are using any opportunity when these humanitarian corridors are open to transport aid into Gaza. I would say, fortunately, we have a few trucks that are queuing at the Egyptian borders today. They are due to come into Gaza today, hopefully, if there's any ease of access into Gaza. And we have also positioned additional resources when it comes to hygiene kits and dignity kits for women in particular. They are waiting in Egypt to be transported into Gaza. And we're working with also other international like-minded organizations to join forces together and try to support as much as possible. This is one of the practical solutions that we are trying to work on. And also, we're also working with our local partners to identify some of the key critical gaps, because no matter how much resources we have, it will always be limited in the face of the current scale of needs. So we're trying to be very deliberate in terms of identifying the key critical gaps. And I think one of the key priorities that we want to address with our local partners in the most direct response now is the winterization. And this is because of now we are at the doorstep of winter here in Palestine. And looking at the devastation, the level of destruction in Gaza, people are going to face harsh reality in Gaza if the winter starts here. And therefore we're looking at what are the most imminent needs in terms of clothing items for the winter. What are the shelter items that are needed in Gaza now to protect people from rain and flooding in Gaza? And also we're looking at some of the medical supplies that might be needed to during the winter season here. And so we're working with our local partners on those assessments. And as I said previously, we've also positioned actual resources in Egypt and Jordan, and we also mobilized some additional fund that will be very much needed for us to scale up the response in of course in the case when the crossings are open to Gaza.
Yeah, it sounds like an impressive effort to try and meet such huge needs, and it's great to hear about that ActionAid's obviously ready to go on the ground to try and respond. And yes, I think it's always a good reminder. We're heading into summer, but to think about people who are heading into a very cold winter with no sort of permanent shelter and very few supplies. So yes, we'll keep trying to think about ways we can fundraise and grow support from the Australian public to help with those efforts, Jamil, because it's critical that people get some of the support that they urgently need. I'd like to, before I go to questions, and I know I can see that questions are starting to emerge. Just to be clear, if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, because we'll be using that to sort of share some questions with Jamil to respond to. But please do also feel free to comment in the chat. It's great to hear you also interacting with some of the really horrendous things that Jamil is sharing, some of the challenges and also obviously some of the hope that emerges from those local efforts to respond. But yeah, so I'd like to go to the West Bank, Jamil, where obviously you're based. And I mean, there's been a lot of attention on Gaza. It's where the media focuses. But, we have been hearing increasing reports of settler violence and I guess been wondering what is happening there in the West Bank at the moment, particularly with, Israel's efforts to continue to annex the Palestinian land, and whether you're seeing any shifts as a result of the ceasefire.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. Well, in the shadow of the war in Gaza and all of the media attention to the war in Gaza, the settler colonial project never stopped in the West Bank. So as you have mentioned, some of the key issues that we are facing in the West Bank, starting from living under effective military occupation in itself, and I will speak about that in a minute, but also having to face a spike in settler violence. And I don't know if settler violence is actually the correct term to use here, because we're talking about heavily armed Israeli settlers protected by the Israeli army, attacking Palestinians, burning houses, burning cars, destroying livelihoods, and also even poisoning livestock, and also uprooting olive trees in a lot of the Palestinian communities across the West Bank. But one of the key developments in the West Bank when it comes to the Israeli military efforts is the campaign of the Israeli army on the refugee camps in the West Bank. And I happen to be born and raised in one of the refugee camps in the northern part of the West Bank, in which also my camp have come under a campaign of destruction, detention and curfews and destruction of infrastructure. But as a result of that, we now have 50,000 displaced people in the West Bank. This is the largest wave of displacement since 1967. When Israel annexed the West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem. So there's a large IDP crisis in the West Bank. And this puts additional pressure also on us as service providers, as humanitarian actors, because we always have to try to balance the resources that we have between the response in Gaza and also making sure that we are responding in the West Bank, because some of the humanitarian needs in the West Bank are unprecedented. And as I said, we still have, up until this moment, 50,000 displaced people. And unfortunately, we've been hearing that the Israeli army have informed local authorities in the northern part of the West Bank that they will only allow 50% of those IDPs to return back to their homes if they find them. Because in particular, in Jenin refugee camp, we know that more than 50% of the houses were completely destroyed. And the infrastructure has also been destroyed. So that's one aspect of what is happening in the West Bank. And as you referred to settler violence, there was a campaign led by far-right ministers in the Israeli government, and this is public, it's all over the news, to arm the settlers, arm the civilian Israeli settlers who are living in the West Bank. So now the current estimates suggest that we have 200,000 pieces of machine guns that were distributed to the Israeli settlers in the West Bank. And unfortunately, these machine guns were actually used. They were used against Palestinians, and we have started seeing a massive spike in the number of fatal attacks by the settlers. So we're seeing Palestinians being killed by the settlers, not by the Israeli army. We have seen an increase in terms of destruction of livelihoods and destruction of homes, and also attacks on the roads, because in the West Bank, we have nearly 1 million Israeli settlers living in illegal settlements in the West Bank. And some of these settlements are actually small cities. So we're not talking about small settlements. And they have all the security apparatus, all the security protection from the Israeli army whenever they are conducting attacks against anything that is Palestinian. So from cars to houses to livelihoods to livestock to trees, farms, anything that comes in the way of these settlers. An additional important update from the West Bank is the fact that since October 7th, 2023, Israel have installed 1,000 gates in the West Bank. And let me try to describe the picture. So each village, town, and city in the West Bank is now gated. So either by an actual gate or by a checkpoint manned by the Israeli soldiers. And this means that the movement of the Palestinian population in the West Bank is completely controlled by these gates and the Israeli military checkpoints. And unfortunately, some of the manifestation of this effective military control, something that I experience every day going to the office, because I live in Ramallah and I work in Bethlehem, and I travel to Bethlehem almost on a daily basis. And the way that movement is being obstructed, because I always say you can determine your time of departure, but you can never determine your time of arrival. Sometimes, because the journey normally is 1 hour from Ramallah to Bethlehem, but it takes me an average 5 to 6 hours every day to go to Bethlehem and then back to Ramallah. And when we look at these checkpoints, unfortunately, in often cases, they're only there to regulate the Palestinian traffic into the settlers' traffic. Because we look at the vast majority of those checkpoints that actually have opening hours. So normally from 6 a.m. to 8:30, 9 a.m., the checkpoints are closed, because that's the time where the settlers go to their businesses and they go everywhere they want to go. And then maybe after 9 a.m., the checkpoints start opening without any checking. So just allowing the Palestinian traffic into the roads of the West Bank. So these are some of the manifestation of the life in the West Bank. Of course, the scale of the humanitarian needs are not anywhere near what's happening in Gaza, but it's still unprecedented for the West Bank, what is happening now. And the fact that living under this effective military occupation is something that gets into everything in your daily life. And you have always to try and think and plan according to what's happening on the ground. So everybody in the morning will be checking the status of checkpoints, which roads are open, which gates are closed, and all of this. So this is becoming, part and parcel of every daily, the daily life of every Palestinian here in the West Bank. And unfortunately, the last thing I want to also cover here, Michelle, is the land grab. So we're seeing a campaign of land confiscation that is sponsored by the Israeli government as well. And we have seen the announcement of the so-called E1 plan, because this is now gaining international reputation, that was endorsed and supported by the US, in which the Israeli government have annexed a large area, a vast area between Jerusalem and the city of Jericho in the eastern borders with Jordan. So this area in the past years it was populated by Palestinian herding communities. So we're talking about Bedouins herding their livestock in that area. But in the past couple of years, they have evacuated all of them, forcibly displaced all of them. There is zero Palestinian presence in that particular area. And now it's been totally annexed. And the next thing we hear from the Israeli government is that they have announced now the settlement expansion projects. So they have announced the construction bids, and they're now working with contractors to start erecting roads and water networks and electricity networks. So you're looking at this, and you travel, for someone like me who travels every day across the roads in the West Bank, every day you see new settlements, you see new outposts, you see settlers are even trying to adopt the lifestyle of the Palestinian Aboriginal people. So we see settlers who have come from East Europe or West Europe now herding sheep in that particular area. Which is something that we often associate with the Palestinian Bedouins and herding communities who have lived there, but now it's been replaced by these settlers. So that's what I said in the beginning. It's a large settler colonial project aiming to grab the land, confiscate the land, evacuate the Aboriginal people from that land, and continue expanding that project. So yeah, that's the reality in the West Bank, Michelle.
Yeah, I have to say it's also really challenging. And I mean, I notice, people are also commenting, for you, even 5 to 6 hours a day that you have to go through increased checkpoints. Having been to the West Bank, having seen, some of those checkpoints, but now to see that there's 1,000 gates that have been built, as well as the increased land I can't even say it. Increased land grabs is probably the easiest way to say it, that have been going on, very much under the radar, because there isn't a lot of, a lot of news coming, about what's happening in that situation. So obviously, I think it's also a call there for us to keep some attention on the West Bank, because I mean the peace deal really, from what I've seen, really only deals with the situation in Gaza. I can see we've got lots of questions emerging. So I'm just going to ask you one last question before we go to some of the questions that have come from people who've been listening. But I mean, Jamil, you're a Palestinian, and I guess I'd love to hear what would you like to see from the future, and particularly, to come out of this peace deal for the people of Palestine.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want this peace deal to be a real peace deal, because as I said in the beginning, it's definitely we don't consider to be a peace deal. And as a Palestinian, I definitely, I think what is most important now is to recognize the rights of the Palestinian people, is to make sure that the rights of the Palestinian, inalienable rights of the Palestinian people are being respected, and the voices of the Palestinian people are being centered in any type of solution. Because without that ownership and buy-in of the Palestinian people, as I said in the beginning, it's only going to be cosmetic. It might delay the conflict for a bit. It might, kind of put it under the carpet for some time. But it's definitely going to erupt if it's not going to be just and permanent and centered around the rights of the people who are living in this land. It will not definitely be viable, and it will not lead anywhere. And unfortunately, all of the international effort continue to be repetitive in the same pattern in which superpowers meet with some countries who have interest in the region, and they want to determine a solution without having the Palestinians on board. And this is what we have clearly seen in the last Sharm el-Sheikh conference. The Palestinian president was invited the night before the event, and there was very little mention or even no mention of any sort of a long-term plan that leads to, granting the Palestinians their self-determination, recognizing the state of Palestine as a sovereign state, but also making sure to work on the ground. Because if we want to introduce any sort of solution in Palestine, you need to address the fact that we have 1 million illegal Israeli settlers in the West Bank. So what's going to happen to those? If we want to address a solution, what's going to happen to the people who have lost their land, their livelihoods in the West Bank? What is the future of Gaza? And we're hearing every type of kind of suggestion for governance in Gaza, but we haven't heard anything that says the Palestinians should be governing their own territory. We're talking about EU mission. We're talking about other countries who are now contributing into a stabilizing force. which will also be seen as foreign interference in a national Palestinian affair. Therefore, I think all of these efforts are not necessarily welcomed by the Palestinian population, I would say. And there needs to be an intentional political effort to make sure that the Palestinians are choosing what they want to see in terms of at least a plan. So we don't expect peace to happen tomorrow or in a couple of years, but at least we have a plan that respects the rights of the Palestinian people and that works towards a sort of the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state and recognizing the rights of the Palestinian.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's make sure whatever comes in the future puts the rights and self-determination of the Palestinian people at the center. I know we've all been watching as, foreign investors are looking at how to maximize the investment opportunity. And it's quite shocking to see, that level of, colonization going on so openly in discussion. So I think we definitely have to do more to make sure, Palestinians can determine their own future and their own governance. There's so many questions here, so I'm just going to try and, address a few with you in the time we have. One of the questions that's come from the audience is around the collaboration between, other NGOs and international organizations operating in Palestine, and I guess how that's worked, whether that's been easy and possible to do in the context.
Yeah. Collaboration and coordination was one of the critical elements that contributed to the humanitarian response in Gaza. And without that collaboration, I don't think any single actor can actually respond to the scale of needs. We already have structures in place, platforms that we use to coordinate. Some of these platforms are facilitated by the United Nations. Others, we have an umbrella organization for all international organizations operating in Palestine, in which we coordinate all of our programmatic responses and operational challenges. We try to come up also together with advocacy initiatives that will also make sure that we are addressing the issues that are happening. And we definitely, on regular basis, we issue statements and calls for third states to intervene in some of the issues that are also affecting us as international organization and limiting our capacity to implement in Gaza. So I would say that coordination and collaboration has been always there, but it has been very critical in the past 24 months for us to work together. And I think as ActionAid, we've also managed to work with a few organizations directly through agreements to transport aid into Gaza. We've also been providing or receiving support from other organizations in terms of needs assessments on the ground in areas where we cannot be there. So there is a lot of information sharing and collaboration that is happening there.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. I guess also a question about journalists. I mean, we've seen, foreign journalists kicked out. Obviously you've already mentioned the, huge numbers of journalists that have been killed, and particularly Palestinian journalists. I guess, the question here is, are more journalists getting into Gaza now? Is that likely to happen under this ceasefire deal?
So far, we can confirm that nobody have managed to come into Gaza as journalists. And there are very few humanitarian workers that are being rotated in and out of Gaza on weekly basis. That's the only people who can come in and out of Gaza, of course, in addition to the Israeli army. But journalists were not allowed. And I don't think that they will be allowed anytime soon, because Israel will always use the excuse that it's not safe, the environment is not safe for the journalists to be there, because I think everybody is seeing the images coming out of Gaza and the level of destruction and damage that was done in Gaza. And I think it's not in the interest of the Israeli government to expose that to the world anymore. I think they will try to delay the entry of international and foreign journalists into Gaza as much as they can.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sure that's a convenient way of sort of hiding what's happening on the ground. I guess also some questions. I mean, you mentioned that, part of ActionAid strategy has been to work with local partners to try and tap into, the local markets. I guess there's a question here about what is actually available in the markets in Gaza, who runs these markets, and do most people in Gaza still have any money at the moment?
I mean, the local market was I think was completely destroyed. So when I talk about the local markets now, I talk about very basic supplies that have remained in Gaza or was transported recently, and we're talking largely about canned food, most of the cases, some flour, and some of the vegetables that are being produced in Gaza. But we're talking about very small quantities in relation to the needs. Now, what we have tried to do throughout the war is to make sure that whenever there is a possibility to purchase at reasonable prices from Gaza, we've kind of provided the financial resources for the partners to do that. But whenever we felt that there was very scarce resources, we didn't also want to contribute to rising the prices because of competition over the very scarce resources. So it was always in consultation with our local partners whether it's a good time to purchase now or not. But at this moment, we don't see any improvement. What was transported into Gaza so far is only humanitarian aid, and it's been handled by UN agencies so far. We haven't seen any large-scale commercial goods allowed into Gaza, which we hope it will happen. But in terms of the financial capacity of the people, I don't know where to begin with, because in that harsh condition, and when there was very little available, the prices have gone up extremely high. And I can give a very quick example in which a sort of one piece of onion was split into 4 pieces and sold in 4 different pieces. Tomatoes was sold by the piece, cucumbers were sold by the piece, and we're talking about some of the prices have gone 3,000 times up, and especially when flour was very scarce. So normally a bag of 25 kilos of flour would be sold for about $20 in Gaza. Throughout the war, it was sold at nearly $500 to $600 in Gaza. So I wouldn't say that we will see an immediate recovery of the market, but we will start seeing some commercial activities that are happening that will allow people who have access to some cash, in which we have also supported throughout the war. We provided lots of what we call multi-purpose emergency cash assistance to the people in Gaza, and we're hoping that with whatever cash is still available in Gaza, because also the banking system was destroyed completely in Gaza, and for people to access cash, they had to pay a commission of about 40 to 50% on the amounts that they are withdrawing. So that's I think it's one sector that we will have to support and start doing baby steps in terms of recovering some of the commercial activities in the market in Gaza.
Yeah, and I mean, and hopefully in the meantime, more aid can come in and support some of those needs. But yeah, quite shocking to hear about, onions split in 4 and the huge skyrocketing of costs. There's another question here about the risk posed by other factions armed by the Israeli government and the risk they pose to internal security in Gaza, particularly if the ceasefire does hold. So I guess if you are able to comment on that situation,
It's very important to see what is happening in terms of these armed groups as a continuation of the genocidal campaign on Gaza. And Israel have actually empowered those groups in particular to make sure that there is always a destabilizing agent inside Gaza, because this is going to serve their overall political ambitions. And this would be one way for Israel to mobilize these armed groups when they want, if it serves their political interest. Therefore, it's a very complex issue to deal with. However, I think in recent days, we have seen that there has been some sort of community effort from the Union of the Palestinian Families, Clans, and Tribes, who have stated their position that they will not provide any cover or provide any support to any family member who will be engaged in criminal activities, assaults on people, theft, looting, or anything. And they have said that they will definitely not provide any sort of protection to that. Now, how the security system is going to play out when it comes to accountability and making sure that these people are being held accountable is something that we definitely look forward to be implemented as part of the ceasefire agreement. So now there are international efforts supporting about 5,000 Palestinian policemen who have been trained in Egypt to be deployed inside Gaza to support restoring civil order and making sure that these gangs or criminal organized groups supported by Israel do not actually become a dangerous destabilizing agent.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's good to hear. I mean, there's probably a follow-on question from this. Obviously, someone building on what you've said around Israel has a long history of disrupting governments in Palestine, first with the Palestinian Authority by creating Hamas, and now seeding these different violent groups to counter Hamas. And there are some reports that they've been stealing humanitarian aid and then trying to sell it back to desperate people. So I guess I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Yeah. Well, so we're not talking about reports. We're talking about credible information. We have seen how Israel have actually empowered those armed groups to loot humanitarian aid by providing. Of course, they were armed by Israel, and now we have information about these particular armed groups that they have been positioned in areas where Israel have asked humanitarian aid convoys to use. So they only identified paths where they knew that the humanitarian aid will be looted by these gangs or armed groups, and then it will be sold in the market at crazy prices. So this happened throughout the 24 months of the war, unfortunately. And now I think one critical report, even by the US intelligence, so they said in the next day after the ceasefire, there was almost zero gang activities in Gaza. There was no looting for the humanitarian aid. Because we know that this type of gang activities is quite alien to the Palestinian community. And we know that they have been empowered intentionally to do to serve this particular purpose. And what we are hoping now is that civil order will be restored as soon as possible, and those will be held accountable by, of course, a legitimate legal process. We're hoping that the Palestinian police will be able to provide in Gaza.
Yeah, great. And well, I can see here another question just around, because I mean, there are often a lot of reports when trucks do get a chance to enter that there's a lot of looting and they're attacked on the way to the destination. And I guess just, I mean, I presume this civilian force may also play a role in trying to avert that. Yeah, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, when it comes to looting, Michelle, I think it will be very important to try to explain and unpack looting a little bit here, because most of the looting activities were actually done by those armed groups empowered by Israel. And there are many international media reports explaining how Israel provided fire coverage. So they provided, drone coverage and military coverage for these gangs to loot the humanitarian aid. So this was happening. We cannot deny it. And this was one of the major challenges we faced. But there is also part of the activities that happened against humanitarian aid convoys were actually fueled by starving population. We have seen so many civilians attacking those aid trucks, quote unquote, and trying to find whatever they can find to provide to their families. So there was lots of that, unfortunately, looting activities that were also used as propaganda against us as international organization by the Israeli government, saying that the international humanitarian organizations are not able to transport aid, are not able to secure it into Gaza, while the Israeli army was doing everything possible in their hands to make sure that the aid is looted and that is going through dangerous combat zones or contaminated roads as we call them, contaminated in the sense that they are controlled by gangs and criminal groups.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, and we appreciate your political analysis, Jamil, because obviously in the media you hear a whole range of different perspectives on this looting, and but at the heart of it, as you've reminded us throughout this call, we need to get at the root causes here, and people are being starved. Aid is being restricted from entering, and this problem can be solved, with coordinated action, and Israel coming to the table to make sure there's aid access without restriction. We're getting very close to the end of the webinar, Jamil. So I wanted to ask you one last question, and that is, I mean, all of us are here because we care about the situation in Gaza and Palestine, and I guess we'd like to know what kind of meaningful action can we take here in Australia right now in solidarity with the people of Palestine.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. But let me begin by appreciating all of the solidarity efforts and activities that happened in Australia. And we have seen the massive demonstration in Sydney, which was a great and strong message that the Palestinian people have received here. So thank you for that. And of course, I need to acknowledge the support of the Australian people and the Australian government to the program in Palestine that we are implementing here. But having said that, and again, just to say that the ceasefire is only a point in time where we have to deal with a new chapter of the humanitarian crisis. Therefore, if Gaza disappears from the news, this doesn't mean that the humanitarian crisis have actually ended. It did not. And therefore, we definitely call for all of you to continue your solidarity activities, to continue your support by also providing donations and supporting the work of ActionAid in Australia, in which we are a close partner with. We have been supporting so many women in the West Bank by money provided by the Australian government, and which is one of our flagship projects actually that I am very, very proud of. And this has been made possible by support of the Australian government. And also we're working with Michelle and the team in Australia to make sure that we generate as much resources as possible to support the humanitarian response and to support the long journey of recovery and rehabilitation of the people in Gaza, and to be able to provide them with adequate resources for them to survive through probably the next 2 to 3 years until the meaningful reconstruction happens and that people are returning to their homes. So just to say that thank you very much. We look forward for your continued support. And we are always happy to provide any information if needed, any sort of priorities or gaps or needs that are emerging in a very shifting situation now in Gaza.
Thank you so much, Jamil. And, I think, we've definitely heard a very strong message from you tonight that, this crisis is far from over. 5 years alone to just remove the rubble from Gaza is just extraordinary. And we're not even getting into the rebuilding, the restoration or re-establishment of basic services, schools, all of those kind of things that are critical for people's survival and their, living a meaningful life. So I really want to, on behalf of everyone here tonight, to thank you tremendously for your time, for your leadership of this effort. We've all been watching along and following, and really appreciate the incredible efforts of ActionAid Palestine and its partners on the ground in Gaza. Please do, thank Jamil in the chat. Join me in thanking him, because I know he can't see the rounds of applause and those kind of things. But yeah, a huge thank you. And please, if I can also say a big thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. We really appreciate all of your support with our campaigns, helping particularly with the letter to the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. We had tremendous support from the Australian population around that. We also really appreciate everyone who has given to the Gaza appeal and continues to give to support these response efforts, and now as we start to think about what we hope will be long-term recovery. I think my colleagues have put in the chat, if you would like to keep donating, the link is there. We appreciate all of your support, and we'll ensure those dollars get to those important efforts on the ground. For any of you who are in Melbourne, we do have one last screening of No Other Land on the 24th of October. If you'd like to, I think there's also a link there if you would like to register for that. It's a great film that really highlights just some of the challenges under occupation, prior to everything that's unfolded over the last 2 years. And so, I think all of us, let's stay in solidarity with Jamil and the people of Palestine, and let's continue to do all we can to make sure the rights and self-determination of the Palestinian people are at the heart of the future. This situation, as we've heard tonight, is far from over. There's a lot more advocacy and campaigning we need to do, and definitely targeting our own government to make sure they step up and put pressure on Israel to not only release aid, but also to make sure there is accountability and justice for the war crimes that have been committed. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you again, Jamil, and we hope to connect with you again soon. Best
Always
wishes.
a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.